Hello, this is Gary Heigl with Rogue Community College, and this video is a quick introduction to how to run the facilitator or the control unit for the iSimulate REALITi system. So we're going to start by selecting our REALITi app on the monitor, and as soon as that comes up, it'll ask us what we want to do, and this is our monitor. Now it's waiting for us to connect, so I go to the facilitator iPad, and I open the app again. And on this one, I'm going to say this is my control unit. It'll open up in my simulation screen, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then I can tap to connect at the bottom, which it looks for a monitor. I confirm that it's the correct one, which is the one we're using today, and I say connect. And it asks me what sort of monitor I want to use. But before I select that, there's also an opportunity to put a student name in. So you can type in a student's name, you can type in an email address. And if you use that, when you're done with the scenario and have a log, you can actually send the log to the student for them to have as a review item if we decide to do that. And you have scenarios you can choose. So rather than pick a monitor from the choices here right now, I'm going to pick a scenario, and I've already chosen within the scenario what monitor I want to use. So I'm going to use the RCC demo scenario, and you can see on the screen that it comes up looking like a LifePak 15. So that's the one we'll use for the scenario. So I want to go through a few things on running the facilitator and sort of the menu choices that you have. The first is pointing out, if you've used the ALSI system in the past that we used to have at RCC, there's some similarities but also some differences. One of the differences, there used to be hidden menus that you'd swipe in from the sides to find a bunch of different menu options, and they've eliminated those, which I think is good because people often forgot they were there. So now all of the menus options are either on the screen or you can open from the screen, and there's one main menu up here in the top left. You push this button and it brings up a few things you can do. The first ones here, well, the first two are to either stop or restart the scenario, but that would only work if we were already running a scenario. Or the other options are you can create a new scenario, you can save the scenario you're working on, or you can save the scenario under a different name. If you want to learn about creating scenarios, I will have a separate video that goes over the steps for doing that. You can also change some parameters. So if you pick the parameter settings, in here you can pick temperature, so we can make that Fahrenheit measurement. CO2 is millimeters mercury. CPR depth doesn't really matter right now because we don't have that technology, but very soon we will have the ability to measure CPR depth of compressions with a device that's synchronized with the iSimulate, so we can also get that feedback. The next one is preserve CO2 for CPR. I like having that on because if you're doing a code type scenario, then if the patient has capnography connected, it will still show a waveform. You just have to set the appropriate value for what you're doing. And then C3 CPR, if you're using a monitor like the Zoll X series that actually has that technology, this will allow the person looking at the monitor to see the underlying rhythm even while CPR is going on. So after you've chosen what parameters you want, you hit save, and unfortunately the menu goes away. So I was just going to go back here for a second and show you that we have scenarios here. So you can also from the main menu pick from a variety of scenarios. We will be adding in numerous scenarios like we had in the ALSI and hopefully even more. But right now there's just 6 of them in there. One is the RCC demo scenario, which is the one that I have loaded right now. So to show you a couple other things, here's RCC demo. So it comes up right at the top to tell me which scenario I'm about to start. And there's an information tab next to it. So if I hit information, this is where you find a variety of things. You have the scenario name, you have the scenario time, so you can set whatever time limit you want. This one's set for 8 minutes right now. You can pick the monitor, so again, I can choose from a whole variety of either ALS or BLS monitors, AEDs, hospital-style monitors, and I'll cancel that because I already have it set. Oops, didn't mean for that to go away. I already have it set for the monitor, the defibrillator that I want, and then I can enter a patient name, gender, age, their condition, that sort of information. So whenever I'm done with that, I can close out of there, and now I'm back at my main screen. Down the left side, we have events. And so the way iSimulate defines scenarios, the scenario is the entire thing The events are the things that happen within it. So the initial event is labeled that way. These are the parameters that you find when you first hook up your device to your patient. And then if the patient is not treated aggressively, in this case we've got a patient in pretty significant respiratory distress, and so if they're not being treated well, I can select this event and the patient will go downhill. If they're being managed very effectively, I can choose this event and they'll get gradually better over a couple of minutes, and I'll come back to that in a minute. At the bottom we have a timer. So as soon as I hit start scenario, it'll start counting how long we've been running this scenario. And right next to it is the alarm that, as I mentioned before, we have set for 8 minutes. It'll start counting down. It does not stop the scenario. You can continue running it as long as you want, but it will turn red once you hit that so that you have something noticeable that you've hit the end of your time period. Once you actually start the scenario, it's now running. And so you noticed that we have the LifePak 15 is there, but nothing's changed because the student hasn't hooked up the monitor, either turned it on or hooked it up to a patient. So now we have our student turn on the monitor and it powers up and tells us that it's powering up, but there's still nothing displayed until the student hooks it up. Now that's something we set in the scenarios, and I have all of mine set up so that it won't show them anything until I display it, meaning they hook it up. So at this point, if our student goes in and hooks up pulse oximetry, right here at the corner of these four displays, these three displays, we have a little eyeball that's crossed out. When I make that visible, they will see capnography. If I just hook up pulse oximetry, I make that visible, they see pulse oximetry. Now right now there's an alarm going off because this person's got an O2 sat of 82%. And there's supposed to be a way within the monitor to turn off the alarms, but you also have the ability here as a facilitator to go to the sounds and just turn this down with a slider. You can turn that down to a low, more tolerable volume. I suggest we turn it down from here rather than silence it completely because we don't want students to be completely ignoring alarms when they go off, but we don't want it so loud that it's a distraction through the whole thing. So if they've hooked up pulse oximetry and see that they have a problem, they hook up their ECG monitor, and so now I make that visible. And if they hook up capnography, they're going to get that capnography waveform. And so since this was a patient in respiratory distress, you can see I've got some shark fin capnography, we've got a crappy O2 sat, and we have a heart rate that's a little bit fast. If they take a blood pressure, just like with the ALSI system, in order to take a blood pressure, that's something that the student does by choosing it where they would on the monitor they're using. On the LifePak 15, the non-invasive blood pressure device is there. And because I have the volume turned down, you can't hear it, but there is the sound of the pump going up, and you can see the numbers as it inflates to take a blood pressure. And just like with the ALSI system we used before, once it's had enough time to actually assess a blood pressure, it'll give us a blood pressure display in the appropriate place on the screen. Now there's several things. Well, let me wait for that to display. So there's our blood pressure that corresponds to what I have set on the facilitator iPad. So if I want to do other things, for instance, right now as this is going, if I notice something going on, down here at the bottom, along with my time and alarm, I have something called flag. So if I notice the student just did something really well, I can say that was really good communication, and it'll timestamp that and save it in the log. If I notice that the team wasn't working very well together and I want to remember to mention that, I can say poor teamwork and it'll do that. So teamwork, communication, those kind of things can be flagged as you go. And there's a stop button. Do not use the stop button unless you're completely done with the scenario and ready to reset with a new group. However, if you want to just pause in the middle of the scenario, you hit the pause, the screen goes blank, everything freezes, the timer stops running. You can have a discussion with the students, address a safety concern, whatever it might be, and when you're ready to go, you hit play again and it picks right up where you left off. So you're right back in the same place. The next thing I wanted to show is, as I was saying, if the students just aren't doing anything about this really sick patient and I hit no aggressive treatment, you'll notice it says trends over 120 seconds. That means that when I hit this, all of the values here are going to change, but they don't change on the student's monitor immediately. They start changing. So you can see the little blue wheel gives you an idea of how far in it is. So over the course of the next 2 minutes, this patient's heart rate is going to speed up to 124, their blood pressure is going to drop, their end-tidal CO2 is going to get worse, and their respiratory rate is going to go up, and their SpO2 actually gets worse instead of better. If at some point the student figures out how sick this patient is, and they do oxygen, they put on CPAP, they start a breathing treatment, they're aggressively treating the patient, I have a pre-programmed option down here that's with good treatment. And again, now we're headed towards better O2 sat, a lower heart rate, better vital signs across the board, and that's going to happen over the next 2 minutes. So it happens gradually, just like it does with real patients, because I've set those up to be trends. The other thing that you can do is you're running this, and I'll go back to the original scenario here right now, and we're going to start, and we just lost connection for some reason. I'm not sure why it doesn't like the initial connection here. So let me instead, we're going to go to our menu, and I'm going to restart this scenario. And it says, are you sure? And I'm going to say, yes, I am sure. And I'm going to start the scenario. So now we're going to have our patient who's hooked up that we just talked about. And your patient is doing this. Rather than using, if you don't have the pre-programmed ones, you can do the same things at any point. So if you decide you want your heart rate to speed up, you simply turn the dial to the rate you want and hit send, and it happens immediately. So now we're up to 131 or 132 because that's what I set it. If you want to do blood pressure, you can change the blood pressure to whatever you want, hit send. It won't change anything on the screen, but the next time they take a blood pressure, it'll reflect the blood pressure that you have. If you want to change any of the things inside these 3 windows, you simply touch on it. So if I decide I want to have a different rhythm, so I want this to look like someone's having an MI, I can do that and hit send, and it will change the ECG waveform. So now they have that. If I want the capnography to go to normal because our breathing treatment worked, I can do that, and the capnography waveform will change to a normal waveform over a couple of seconds here. I also, can slow down the respiratory rate, which will make it more obvious and easier to see that we've got an improvement in our capnography waveform and an improvement in our level as well. So those are some changes we can do. A few other things that you can change on the fly is you can go over here, and we have a variety of things. There are checklists. I don't have any checklists built in this scenario, but if we want, we can build in checklists for things we anticipate students doing, like applying oxygen, intubating the patient, whatever fits the scenario. And when they do it, you simply hit a checkbox. So in the log at the end, you'll know that they did those things. You'll also know what things you expected them to do that they didn't do. You have sounds that I mentioned, you have the volume control, but you can also have conversations. So when you're using a mannequin for this, if you want the patient, there's a whole variety of them in here, that if you want the patient to say things,
my chest hurts,
they'll tell you in a very nice Australian accent that they have
I want to go home.
have a complaint or something, and there's a variety of choices. You can look through the different options that are there. Little awkward sometimes to find the right phrase to fit the circumstances, but there's also moaning and wheezing and coughing and things like that that you can do, as well as wheezes and crackles and a variety of lung sounds. And if you want, you can even go to the user recordings, and if you hit the microphone, you can make your own recordings ahead of time of whatever it is you want your patient to say for the scenario. The other thing that we have is media. There's nothing in there yet, but we can upload files to this. So if you have a picture of a scene that you want the students to see what the scene looks like, or a 12-lead ECG tracing that you want an image of, or a variety of things, we can do that. And there's also a place for putting lab values, which doesn't apply for most of what we do, but it is an option that's there. The last thing I want to show is down here at the bottom is the CPR box. And so there's a variety of parameters you can put in here. There's PEA, which is new with the REALITi system, and CPR like we had before. So if, for example, we put this patient into a, let's put them into a fine VFib, and we'll say go. And the machine's smart enough to know that the minute they go to VFib, they have no O2 saturation, no blood pressure, but capnography's still there, so I have to pay attention. And if someone's bagging this patient at 12 a minute, then I should set it at 12 and have the capnography reflect the value that I want it to have. So with say CPR is underway, we're probably not going to have much better than 20, and so I can make the capnography reflect that poor level of carbon dioxide exposure. Now, once I hit the CPR button, it will turn red, meaning I've started CPR. So on the monitor, you'll see the evidence of CPR being done. You don't see the underlying rhythm because the LifePak 15 doesn't have that. On a Zoll, you would be able to see it with the see-through. But if your compressor is going faster than 110, you can change the rate to match what they're actually doing. So if you're trying to make sure that your person knows they're going too fast, if they're going 140 or 150 compressions a minute, you can speed it up and hopefully they will notice that they're going faster than they ought to be and can adjust accordingly. You can also adjust that rate here with, oh, no, I'm sorry, you cannot adjust it. You have to adjust it here. It just changes up on the screen to reflect that. And so if they come back down to an appropriate rate where we want them to be, then we can see that on the monitor and monitor the effectiveness of their CPR. So as soon as they stop CPR to check the rhythm to deliver a shock, then it shows them the underlying rhythm. And just with the ALSI system, if they recognize this as shockable, they're going to hook up their defibrillation pads. They're going to choose an energy level. They're going to charge it up. Hopefully clear their patient, and they're going to shock the patient. Energy is delivered. We can preset our scenario to determine whether or not that shock is successful or whether the second or third shock is successful, and then it'll jump to another rhythm. But as soon as they start CPR again, I'm going to do CPR. Let's say that at the end of the next cycle, they got a sinus rhythm back. I just changed it to a sinus rhythm. However, because they're doing CPR, they can't see that. So if they get to the end of their 2-minute cycle and they stop CPR, now they're going to see an underlying rhythm. And this is where you have to be a little quick with the scenario, is that if you want them to have pulse oximetry, if you want them to have a blood pressure, you need to make those changes to correspond to the change. But at any time, even if you've got a blood pressure, even if you've got respiratory rate and a pulse, and that's going on with your patient, if you hit PEA, it will assume that the rhythm stays the same, but everything else goes away. So it's smart enough to know when you push PEA, pulses are gone, which means you lose oxygen saturation, you lose the blood pressure, you lose a pulse obviously, but you still have a heart rate, and hopefully they identify that they need to start CPR and continue. So all of those parameters are a lot like what we had with the ALSI system, just a little bit more sophisticated. And there are a variety of additional things we can do, especially if you spend the time to build some scenarios. But this gives you the basics of how to start a scenario, run a scenario, and move around. I encourage you to do this, to practice with them, to play around with the options and look at what they produce prior to doing it in classes or in scenarios with students, so that you get comfortable finding your way around. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you very much.